So I'm not going to sit here and pretend like Lil Pump is some kind of avant-garde rap savant, or that he really is fully aware of what he's doing. I don't believe those things, but also I'm not going to pretend like I am impervious to the thralls of catchiness, which I'm not. I think it's easy to, when you hear something for the first time, it's easy for your brain to automatically reject it, and I think that is probably what mine did the first time I heard SoundCloud rap to some degree, mumble rap, and this was a few months ago, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, and I remember just putting it aside in my brain as this kind of music that I just wasn't going to ever get into, or something I found to some degree to be useless or inconsequential, and many people still do believe these things, and I definitely, in listening to the album, I had to remind myself of trying to remove myself away from those paradigms of thinking. Anyway, so I listened to the Lil Pump album a few weeks ago. Again, this is part of my listening to these XXL freshmen, because I did. It's a little bit of background. I don't know, and I've never listened to any of these artists, so I'm very interested in seeing how rap as a genre, hip hop, seems to be progressing, or not progressing, but seems to be moving towards with this new kind of crop of artists. I did Slump God, Ski Master Slump God, a few weeks ago, and now it's Lil Pump. I heard many bad things about Lil Pump, and people always think about Lil Pump as this kind of trash hip hop artist. So those were my expectations going in, but I tried to keep my mind as open as I could. And the reason why I opened it up with this kind of dealing with whether or not with this is avant-garde and whatever, the album, as many people and I'm sure many people have talked about this before. I don't know. I don't actually read any reviews or anything. Or I haven't read anything about what people think about Lil Pump, but Lil Pump is fascinatingly minimalist. Now, this is obviously something that I've talked about before when I listened to Playboi Carti, but Lil Pump is like minimalist in its most maximalist sense, if that makes any sense. He has songs. I mean, if you're listening to this, you probably have listened to Lil Pump, but he has songs where he just repeats like two or three words, two, three, 4, 5 words over and over again for like 60-70% of the song. This is so it's so minimal that there seems to not even seem to have, it doesn't even seem to have like a intrinsic meaning of sorts, to some degree. I mean, obviously the words have their own meanings, but then when I listened to the album, it felt like I was not hearing what he was saying. I was just hearing these repetitious sounds being said over and over again in a way that felt kind of trance-inducing to some degree. Now, I don't want to give him so much credit, because I'm sure many people have done this before, but for me, at least in my own experience of listening to hip-hop music, I haven't seen it employed in this amount of, like, to this extent, I mean. So, for example, obviously the very common, and not very common, one of his more popular songs, Gucci Gang, which I've seen many memes about. I've never listened to the song until I checked the album out. And the first time I listened to the song, it was kind of what I expected, but the more I listened to it, the more one got stuck in my head, of course, and the more I started to get kind of, I don't want to say impressed, but I was just surprised by just the extent at which the song is just this repetitive mantra-like chanting of sorts. And for those who are unfamiliar with the history of minimalism as a genre, not that I know much about it, but from what I understand, at least in the probably 50s, 60s, 70s, you have people like Philip Glass, for example, Lamonte Young, these composers, classical composers, who are trying to subvert the medium of classical music, I think, mostly, and trying to find a way to emphasize the repetitive aspects of sound. So they'd have these, they were pioneers of electronic music, and they would make these epics of sorts that were of little sonic differentiation to some degree. I mean, there was a lot of it, but it was it was like it was something like you would hear the same sound over and over again after the first like minute or so, and then after a minute there'll be a slight change, or the note will change slightly, or they'll add another piece to it. Another famous musician who I'm a big fan of is Steve Reich. He does music for 12 musicians, I think is what it's called, and it is very trance-like. And again, minimalism as a genre seems to have been one of the biggest proponents and biggest reasons why trance music became a thing. Techno music, for example, in the, I like to say 80s, 90s, perhaps Detroit techno was a big thing in the 80s, but musically, this idea of just having constant repetition over and over again to induce you into a trance-like state has been such a big part of music history, at least in the last 40 years, that I don't necessarily mean to suggest that Lil Pump is influenced by Lamonte Young or Steve Reich or Philip Glass or anything like that, but I am seeing parallels to the level of repetition, because again, when I was listening to some of his songs, I mean, not all of his songs are like this, but then a good number of them, a number enough that surprised me, where they would repeat maybe a phrase and it just goes over and over again to the point of numbness, right? Obviously, it wasn't like structured in the same way, of course, of these minimalist composers, but then it was a big section of the song that would just be repetition, mantra-like repetition, and I found it quite enticing. It was very interesting for me, because again, I was not, to some degree, I was listening to the music in a way where I felt detached from the actual words and the intrinsic meaning of the words, and I was listening to it as sounds, and the sounds of the songs, when you just focus on the sounds, you really focus on the repetitive nature of it, and that's how I was able to extrapolate it to like early electronic and techno music. What I find very fascinating about that idea of repetition and all this stuff is that my theory, which is, I don't necessarily know if this is true or how much of it, I believe it might be very true, but my theory is that the purpose of the repetition in Lil Pump's music, and perhaps many of his contemporaries, I would say, is to, if I were to guess, it would be in some way, some kind of bringing the feeling of drug-induced sedation or euphoria into the musical scene. So that sounds sort of, from what I understand, a lot of these rappers now are very strongly influenced by Xanax, for example, and benzos and all this stuff that when you take, make you very sedated and keep in your head goes in kind of circle to some degree. I mean, this is not something that I'm just getting out of the air. This is specifically from the idea that a lot of music in general comes from its relationship with psychoactive drugs. When you think of this idea of repetition, for example, techno music is very popularly influenced by ecstasy, MDMA in the 80s. When MDMA became the drug of the youth in the 80s, there was a search to which one where musicians and producers were trying to replicate, not necessarily replicate MDMA, but they were trying to create a drug that was, or they were trying to create music that was synergistically compatible with the drug. And while I may have never taken Xanax, I've never taken Xanax, so I don't necessarily know for sure, but my theory is that the music in some way synergistically complements certain states of altered consciousness that may be part of the drug culture that a lot of the younger rappers right now are a big part of, and that is my theory of sorts. I don't exactly know, but I know that many of them, so opiates, for example, I don't necessarily have personal experience with strong opiates, but from what I understand, it makes you very relaxed and perhaps more in tune with the vibe or something. I'm not sure for sure, but that is my theory of sorts, and it's very interesting for me because I'm looking at this very in a historical point of view, and I think of music and its influence and its like codependence on certain drug cultures. It's very interesting for me personally to just think of it in that lens, of course. And I started listening to the album. I wasn't, so I know that Lil Pump is one of the big SoundCloud kids. He's 17, so he's very young, and his music, like I said earlier, I know I haven't really been talking about his music specifically. I don't really think there's that much to talk about sonically. I mean, what's interesting I think also is that this SoundCloud generation is really subverting the expectations of high quality production. Now this is not to say that the production is bad per se, but a lot of it very sounds unmixed, or at least a lot of it sounds roughly mixed, and sometimes the if you're listening on good headphones, for example, the peaks of some of the songs are noticeable, and I think it is interesting because there is a direction towards a lack of concern anymore of production, which I don't think is a bad thing per se. I think it is interesting. It's interesting how I'm not sure if they're purposefully putting out badly mixed songs in order to make a statement, a la some kind of, art pop or something from pop art. I mean, from the 60s. I don't know if they're actually going to that much thought into all this stuff. Maybe they're just badly produced and they're lazy. Who knows? But what it definitely has been able to show is that production quality and what people usually perceive as the need for what necessitates high production quality in music, it seems like people don't actually care. At least the general public doesn't actually care that much. Perhaps they don't really have the instruments to notice it more, or perhaps they just find the personalities behind it more important than the actual production quality of the music. And that's what it all is. Lil Pump is a personality. I've seen his Instagram page. I've seen some of his interviews after listening to the album. He's a personality, and he has a very unique, I don't want to say unique, but he has a very distinct voice in terms of his persona and his what he kind of shows to his fans and all this stuff. But whatever. I liked I think I like Gucci Gang. I like the song with Chief Keef, Whitney. I like Flex Like Oh, Ooh. I don't know. I think I liked Iced Out. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, he has a song called D-Rose, which I find particularly odd, because I mean, obviously at the time when he was making this album, Derrick Rose was probably much of a higher acclaim than he is right now, but he's not really that big of a deal right now, so it feels kind of dated to have your song be called D-Rose when Derrick Rose is not really. But that's nothing to do with the album. Anyway, whatever. I liked it. I think it's catchy. The more I listen to it, the more the hooks get stuck in my head. It's very repetitive, very hypnotic, very trance-like to some degree, and in direct comparison to Ski Mask and Slump God, obviously Ski Mask is more interested in lyrical finesse and humor, and his voice is definitely, his rapping style and technique is very entrancing. Lil Pump not so much, but it's interesting. I'm fascinated by him, and I'm interested in hearing what he does next, because this whole album is kind of it's to some degree, it's kind of one note, but in one note in a way that is very statement making, because he's trying to perhaps solidify his sound, and this is the sound he wants to present himself as, so it's fine. Yeah, Lil Pump.